Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Timo Kuosmanen, a professor from the University of Turku in Finland. As you know, Professor Kuosmanen is a key figure in the field of efficiency and productivity analysis, which is the line of research of many of us here at the research center. Professor Kuosmanen has published in many papers in different topics, making very important contributions. For example, we all know STOMET, an interesting approach where he combines DA and stochastic analysis. Or recently, we are very interested in a topic introduced long time ago, conditional complexity. We are collaborating in some paper with him. So we are very happy to have him here with us. We also have with us Natalia. Natalia is Professor Kuosmanen's wife. Also, not only his wife, he is, for example, a co-author of the paper he is going to present now, and he's a member of the research project that brings them here. So we are very happy to have both of them here. Yeah. We are looking forward to your talk. So if you're ready, we are going to hear.
Yeah, thank you very much for this introduction and the opportunity to give a talk. So happy to have this brief visit here again. So besides myself and Natalia, there is also Terry Machulski from ETLA is a co-author of this work, and this is something that we are been working on recently, and we hope to publish this working paper next week. So this is kind of really ongoing work. How much time do I have? But anyway, if we are not restricted the time, then feel free to interrupt and ask questions as we proceed if there's something unclear. So this is not very technical paper compared to what many of you are working on, but I try to also connect make some connections to operational research type of work as we proceed. So I'm going to talk about productivity effects of mergers, acquisitions, and corporate restructuring. So that's sort of special form of structural change or something like creative destruction. And in economics, there's been a lot of interest in this kind of so-called creative destruction. There is this famous notion from Joseph Schumpeter already from the 1940s, and you can think about it as some kind of evolution of industries. It's similar like evolution theory in biology, that there's survival of the fittest, that in some sense inefficient firms tend to do badly, and then they are driven out of market, and then more productive, more efficient firms survive, and they're growing and expanding, and then there can be some new firms that come to the market, and they may be even more efficient, and they are kind of replacing the old ones. So this is this kind of evolution of industries going on, at least at the sort of conceptual level. Since the 1990s, there's been also then interest in trying to quantify these kind of effects of creative destruction. So I cited here a couple of papers. There's Bailey et al., Kriegers and Rachel look at more this kind of entry and exit of firms and how that influences the more aggregate level productivity, like at industry level. And then there is another important, this Olli and Bakes you might have seen in multiple different contexts. They look at this kind of reallocation of resources. So of course this allocation of resources is also kind of a classic operational research topic. But in some sense, this kind of industrial organization literature has kind of been going its own path, and then in operational research, this kind of allocation of research, optimal allocation of research is going somewhat differently. So in this study, we are going to focus on just simply labor productivity. So I know that many of you are working with this kind of frontier estimation techniques and DEA and kind of that would be kind of natural to then think of total factor productivity. When we were publishing our first papers on this structural change, we actually also were using total factor productivity, but then it was so hard to get through these review processes because somehow everybody has their own favorite frontier estimation technique, and eventually some referees were suggesting, why don't you just use labor productivity? And so then we could go in this sort of simple way in that sense. But of course, everything what I'm going to present, you could also do it with total factor productivity. And there is also in the DEA literature, there is some interest in this aggregation of units. So I have here mentioned this works by Rolfare and Yannis Karagiannis on this kind of denominator rule. And of course, Rolfare has done also other work on this aggregation of units. So for example, if you have some industry consisting of capital N firms, so how do you connect this kind of, let's say, firm level efficiency or firm level productivity to industry level? And this is fairly simple when we talk about labor productivity. So here I just define industry level labor productivity. It's just labor productivity is the ratio of output to labor input. We typically have in these studies we use value added as the output, and so that's this monetary output, and labor input is like full-time equivalent workers. So then the industry productivity, if you think of some kind of statistics agency, then they would simply add these have the total value added of the industry, and then labor would be total workforce of the industry. That's the ratio. And then the second equation then shows this connection that's fairly straightforward, but it's not so obvious to everybody actually. So we can also write this industry level productivity as the sort of weighted average of the firm level productivity. So if you think of the firm level productivity, it would be this lowercase y divided by lowercase l. That would be the labor productivity of firm I in some period t. And then if you think of this ratio of lowercase l to capital L, that's this labor share, how many workers in certain, what's the share of this total industry workforce allocated to specific firm. So if you define this S, sorry, this is like different ordering, but this S here is this share weight refers to this labor share, and then this lowercase p is this firm-specific productivity level. So now we talk about levels, not changes. That's then easy to see that with these we can get this industry level productivity as this kind of share weighted average of the firm-specific productivities. An important point that I mentioned here is that to have this kind of consistent aggregation, we need to have this kind of labor shares, not for example market shares or revenue shares or something like that. So many papers in the economic literature actually use some kind of revenue shares, for example. That's sort of maybe intuitive to think of market shares, but then this aggregation doesn't go right in that case. So you need to have this kind of input-based shares to aggregate to make this consistently. Everything clear so far? Mm-hmm. Good. So then I come to this first simplest decomposition so anyone familiar with this Olli-Bakes formulation? I explained it then because that's also important for our further steps. So this is what I left with this aggregate productivity, with this as the share weighted average of the firm specific productivities. So then this is very widely used and formulation by Olli and Bakes in econometric by '96 that they showed that we can write this industry level productivity as this kind of average. So that's just arithmetic average of these firms' productivities plus then this kind of covariance term, or this second component, we can think of it as this kind of reallocation or allocation component that then depends on these share rates and these productivities. So here these deltas, they are not changes over time, but they are differences on the mean. So basically this second component then we can interpret as the covariance of these shares and these productivity levels. So the big insight here is that at this aggregate level of the industry, productivity can grow if this second component increases over time. So if you get, for example, more workers allocated to high productivity firms and less to the low productivity firms, then, for example, this average productivity doesn't need to change at all if you have this kind of reallocation that improves the industry level efficiency. So if you think about, for example, like technical progress, that often we think of traditionally that productivity growth comes from technological advances. So that would typically then affect all of the firms or most of them. So in some sense, this average, this P upper bar reflects this kind of technological change. And then the second part is this kind of reallocation. So if you think of this Schumpeter's creative destruction, that there is this kind of inefficient producers losing market share and eventually being given off the market, and maybe there's more productive firms entering the market and high productivity firms growing, then all of that will then contribute to the second component. So this can sort of boost this industry level productivity. Of course, there can be also, let's say, government regulations or kind of imperfect competition or monopoly power, which can be also then decreasing component, this second component. So that's of course quite interesting, that what is happening with this kind of allocation component. And when we look at also these changes over time, then we can of course look at, okay, what happens to this average level of the firm's productivity versus this allocation component, that are they changing over time, and what is like going to be important. But in many empirical studies, we see that the second component is quite important for the industry level productivity growth. And that's something that I mean, it's for a long time well known in industrial organization literature. But if you think of this kind of frontier literature or DEA literature, I don't think that there's much this kind of attention. That very often people just sort of tend to if there is entering firms or exiting firms, you sort of drop them out from the sample and we'll have a balance panel, and then sort of miss that part, and then also mainly focus on this sort of average productivity or average. So let's say if you have Malmquist index, and you look at some kind of average Malmquist index. But the second part is also can be actually even much bigger than this average productivity change. So that's something that can be quite straightforward to incorporate also to, for example, some kind of Malmquist index type productivity analysis. But I haven't seen it done much in that literature. Where did we become interested in this literature? We have, I don't go to a lot of details, but we had 2021 we published in Structural Change and Economic Dynamics this paper, where the main point was that we wanted to do this for a sample of firms. So at that time we were using agricultural data, and we didn't observe all of the farms, but we had some kind of samples of farms, and then we would have this kind of industry level productivity. And then basically our analysis was based on the fact that if you have this Olga-based formulation, then of course we can always get this kind of covariance term just as a difference of this. If you can have some kind of aggregate level, for example, this National Statistical Agency gives us this kind of capital P, and we have a sample of farms that we can calculate this lowercase p. So then of course we have some kind of difference between sample and population, but basically anyway we can estimate this covariance term based on just a random sample of farms. So we don't need to actually have these share rates to get at least some kind of idea about this how large this allocation component could potentially be. And but then we have also started to also ask more detailed questions that what does this actually mean, this kind of entry and exit of firms. That typically this kind of story goes in the literature that we basically observe in data that some firms we used to observe, but then they disappear from our data. And then there's some new data points appearing in our data, and we sort of equalize that as market exit or market entry. And but then we were looking at this. We had a study on Finnish ICT industry, and if you have, for example, some kind of specific industry code that you're following certain specific industry, then it can happen that there's actually new entrants, which are actually not totally new firms. And we had this example of, for example, iPhone being introduced by Apple. So there's suddenly in mobile phone market you have a very large company, Apple. But Apple was not at that time a new firm. Of course, it had been already a long time in the computer industry. So it entered the mobile phone market with this new revolutionary product. And then, of course, in Finland, it was very important shock for our economy that at that time the world's largest mobile phone manufacturer, Nokia, after 6 years after iPhone was introduced, they actually exited the mobile phone market. So they left the market, but Nokia still exists, so it didn't go bankrupt or become non-existent. So these two examples illustrate that it's possible that this entry to a specific market can be also through this kind of product switching, that companies introduce new products or new lines of products, or they enter some new sort of industry or line of industry. And we had this another paper on journal productivity analysis that was also building on this our previous work looking at this kind of industries. But I get down to this our new research. So we're still also considering this that how does this entry and exit, or what does it really mean? And then another type of complication that we observe in the data is that sometimes these firms disappear through mergers and acquisitions, and this is very often, if you think about startup scene, that very often the whole purpose of a startup firm is to grow until you become acquired by some bigger player. And then there can be also opposite of this kind of mergers and acquisitions. Sometimes there's sort of a firm is split into two parts, or there's a kind of spin-offs, or sometimes it can be also that firm temporarily exits, but then these owners or workers, they start a new firm, so they can be also sort of phoenix type structures. And that can of course sort of mess up this kind of decomposition, as I will try to show you next. So here I try to illustrate how this data would roughly look like. So this is this kind of conventional classification that when we look at productivity change from some base period 0 to target period 1, so this would be period 0, this would be period 1, and we try to measure the productivity change from period 0 to period 1. So typically, of course, we will just focus on these continuing firms, that we observe them both in period 0, period 1, and if you have something like labor productivity, it's very simple. You just calculate this productivity change. The challenge in the literature comes on, okay, what about this kind of exiting terms that we observe in period 0, they are no longer existing in period 1. And same applies to new firms that enter the market. So there are some firms that are only observed in period 1, but they didn't exist in period 0. So that's a kind of challenge in many of these kind of decompositions. So now what we want to do then in this study, we still split each of these groups to 2 parts. So maybe I start with this exiting firms. So those firms that disappear for one reason or another, there can be this kind of genuine exits, for example, through bankruptcy, or then there can be some kind of restructuring, mergers or restructuring. For the entering, same way we have this kind of genuinely new firms, but then there can be also entry through restructuring. So, for example, some firm over here disappears, but then it starts with a new name and new firm code. And then another interesting part is with this continuing, we also have this kind of firms that are basically acquiring some firms. They will acquire. They didn't have it period 0 yet, but after period 1 they have acquired some of these. So basically, this group here is going to move, or it's going to move either up to here or down to here. So then we have this kind of sort of clean continuing firms that do not have any merger or acquisition activities, and then we have this kind of another group of firms that continue operating, but they have made some acquisitions. And that distinction actually then affects all of these groups, because if we don't take that into account, then this can also cause some kind of bias for these continuing firms as well. Okay, everything clear so far? So then, how do we then identify this kind of course, there's a lot of different legal forms of corporate restructuring, and that's the kind of tricky part then empirically as to how do we actually recognize this kind of mergers and other type of corporate restructuring. So here we then build on a couple of previous studies that use this kind of workflow data to identify this type of corporate restructuring. And so basically what we use is, we have in Finland quite comprehensive register-based data. So we get from tax authority and other authorities, and we get this kind of, what is it, this annual business register panel, this kind of data for the firms. But not only that, we can also connect all of the workers of the companies. So we can also look at this kind of individual worker level data, that which company they are working at, and we see, for example, if somebody is switching jobs from one year to another, and so we utilize this in the spirit of this Benedetto et al. And Hittemeyer and Schmieder, that we look at some kind of bigger clusters of workers that are moving jointly from one company to another. We are not interested in individual workers switching jobs, but rather that there is a large proportion of workers that together are leaving and going to another business entity. And we have tried slightly different thresholds of this kind of barriers, but I think our co-author is more like a labor economist, so she prefers this 75% threshold. We had also earlier used 60%, which is a little bit more kind of well, smaller value. What does it mean? So if for example 60% of one company, 60% of their employees move to another company, then we think that it's some kind of restructuring going on. If there's more than half, 60% going together, But then 75% is then even stricter. There's always a risk that, okay, if you put the threshold too low, then there's some kind of just people going coincidentally. But then if it's too big, then it might be that there's somehow we miss some kind of effect in mergers. So we don't really care about this kind of legal form of this mergers or restructuring. We basically look at how these kind of workers going together, and we call it sort of de facto merger in that case. So I think in the paper that we will get out, we will focus more on 75, but my slides are based on this older 60% threshold, but it doesn't make actually very big difference what the threshold actually is. Okay. So there is then this kind of this more specific definition of these new groups that we form that reflects all these continuing firms, and then this restructuring and restructuring exits. But I guess that's already very clear by now. So I get a little bit to results. So maybe first, how common this kind of restructuring versus genuine entries. So we will have a time period from 2010 to 2022, and if you look at this, all of these groups, and by the way, I will focus more on the manufacturing sector in Finland. We have done similar also for the service industries, but the results are very similar. Many findings are similar. So what does these percentages mean? So if you look at here 2010, 78% of the workers in manufacturing sector were in this kind of firms that continue operation till 2022, and they don't have any mergers. 5% of the workers were in this kind of continuing firms, which did have some kind of mergers and acquisitions. And if you look at the same from this 2020 perspective, then this percentage has increased to 8%. That's because these firms are growing through these mergers. They have acquired some other units, and in relative terms, this first group kind of decreases. Then, if you compare this genuine exits and restructuring exits, so they were almost equally large groups, so that 9% or 8%. I should say that these genuine exits in terms of number of firms is much bigger, but these restructuring exits are often they are typically larger. So in terms of labor shares, they are roughly equal. And same applies to this restructuring entry and also the genuine entry. So it's not like something extremely rare that this kind of restructuring is happening. It's almost as common as this kind of generally new and closing down firms in terms of employment. If we divide it into 4 different subsections in terms of time, we see that especially this period 2013-2016, it was mostly actually based on our data, where this is now number of firms rather than employees. So as we noticed earlier, most of the firms are in this kind of continuing without any kind of restructuring, but then there's some mergers also occurring and entry and exit activity. And this is, of course, for this kind of creative destruction very important, that there is this kind of turnover of firms, that some inefficient producers are leaving and then some new ones are replacing. So yeah, let's look at then more how this labor productivity behaves before exit, for this exiting firms. So these are firms that are disappearing. And for those groups that we classify as genuine exits, so these are these firms that are closing down. So we see that the labor productivity is decreasing already 5 years, or especially last 3 years before closing down, it's has this kind of decreasing productivity trajectory. Whereas this kind of restructuring exits, so firms that we associate with restructuring, the level of productivity starts higher, and we don't see similar kind of drop in the productivity before the exit. So these are these averages, and then 95% confidence intervals for those two groups. So that also suggests that these are kind of potentially targets, for example, for some kind of merger and acquisition. And by the way, this is kind of like a little bit inspired by this event study graph. So here that year 0 is when this firm is leaving, but it's within this 12-year. So of course, this kind of exiting firms are not exiting at the exactly same year, but we plot them on this kind of zero axis is when this exit is happening, and then 5 years before. So we combine it from different calendar years to this axis. Okay. What about entering firms then? So here is then restructuring entry and genuine entry. So this broken line is this kind of genuinely new firms. So if we compare these two groups, then we see that this productivity is growing in both groups. The genuinely new firms start with a somewhat lower level, but there is perhaps some little bit of catching up, not much, but anyway, there is somewhat catching up. However, if you compare this restructuring entry, so they start slightly over 60,000 euros per employee, and these which are exiting, that's also sort of similar. So those that move from this group to that group, there is not a huge effect in that. However, if you compare these ones that start here with the 40, with these that left with this kind of 30, so these are like closing down and sort of being replaced by these ones. So that's kind of reason why we can have some kind of positive contribution through this kind of churning, that there is this low productivity firms closing down and being replaced by more productive ones. So finally, what happens with these merging, these kind of acquiring firms? So these are these kind of typically larger continuing firms that have made some kind of acquisitions. And this is for the manufacturing sector. So here again, 0 is where this acquisition is happening. So before that, then we see that there is on average relatively high productivity, about 70,000 euros per worker, and then there's quite sharp drop at the time of the merger. Probably there is a lot of this kind of new corporate structures, and there is a sort of confusion how this kind of new entity is operating, and then there's gradual recovery, like then this after the merger, then the productivity starts to increase. We see that there is like this labor input is responding immediately, so the labor input typically jumps higher due to this acquisition, but then it takes much longer time to then have value added, this output side response then more slowly. There's quite wide confidence interval, because we have only 100 observations during this 12-year period that we observe. I think when we look at service industries, we have much bigger sample, and the pattern is still very, very similar. There is this kind of temporary drop and then gradual recovery. So that's this kind of interesting pattern that we observe. So then finally, we have also some kind of this, how do we get to this kind of decomposition? So if we want to make this kind of systematic decomposition, then I first want to give you intuition that how do we think about this kind of different subgroups. So at the core of the industry, like we saw, that there's this continuing firms which do not have any mergers or acquisitions. That's the biggest group of firms. So we kind of think of that as this kind of so that's kind of immune to this kind of restructuring that we are interested in. And then this kind of second group is this continuing firms that do make some kind of acquisition. So together, these first two groups are these continuing firms. And then we add this kind of restructuring entry and exit as the second layer, because in some sense they are not really closing down, or they are not really new. They just kind of, for example, firms that change the name or company ID. So they are kind of the third layer. And then last one is this kind of genuinely new firms that didn't exist before, and then there's those that are closing down completely. So this kind of hierarchy is then this key for this kind of decomposition formulation that we then have. So then we have this kind of it's fairly straightforward anyway. We look at this kind of productivity change over time as a ratio, and then we just start adding up these different kind of groups. So we start from this continuing firms without any kind of merger or acquisition activities, and then we sort of start adding these additional layers until we get all of those groups covered. So that's mathematically fairly straightforward. And then finally, we need to also have this contribution of reallocation. So that's this onion takes component that I started with. So even when we add all of the groups together, we don't catch up everything, because there's still these kind of labor shares of those different groups can also, or firms within those groups can also change. So that's the decomposition formula. That's based on this our previous papers, but in this case we just adapted to this kind of setting. So let me then show some results. What does it then yield in the end? So we have manufacturing industries here, and if you think of more like short-term effects, so we divide our time period to. So here is this kind of 4 different sub-periods within this 12-year period. So we look into this kind of Olympiads, so to speak, 4-year periods. So typically when we look into this kind of structural changes of industry, so 1 year is very short time, and there's relatively little restructuring. So most of the action would in 1 year would happen in this top line. But when we look at a little bit longer time periods, then there's more action happening with this restructuring. And we find that particularly this continuing firms that have this acquisition. So that was this graph that I showed you with this initial dive in this labor productivity. So that has actually huge contribution, negative contribution to the manufacturing industry labor productivity. So most of this, so it's very typical pattern that these continuing firms have a positive, fairly modest but positive productivity growth, and then it is this kind of structural change components that have positive or negative coefficients. And particularly in the first 2 sub-periods, it was quite drastic this merger effects, and that's why then at the industry level it was even negative, despite this kind of positive productivity in the continuing firms. So that's sort of interesting that this at the aggregate level, this productivity figures cannot be very different from what this average of the firm level would look like. And I remember actually that my initial motivation to look into that was that I was in at the OECD meeting in Paris, that there was this kind of agricultural productivity. People were worried or wondering that, well, how it is possible that this firm level studies have like so different productivity than this kind of industry level studies, and that's the reason why it happens that this kind of structural change components can be influencing a lot. We also then look at a little bit longer term. So here is we divide it in 2 sub-periods and versus then we put everything in together. So also this kind of perspective matters, that we look into just very short term, just 1 year or a few years. So actually many of these what we have here, they just cancel out when we take a longer time period. So that if you look at this, let's say, totally 12-year period, actually most of the action happens now in this continuing firms. So this is a kind of technological progress, and these kind of structural changes are relatively small. Mainly this what the influences here is this this is just this kind of sum of this, and then this only-based component is one of the bigger positive contributions. But if you take like long enough time period, then actually what matters is this average of the continuing firms. So that's sort of, you can think of that as technical progress that is going there, and this kind of cancel out. So yeah, then of course, like if you think about this kind of connection to the more like Malmquist index studies, that there is of course this kind of technological change and efficiency changes. So we could of course then break down this. I think it would be mainly this first part that could be broken down to more details. That to what extent it is. I just sort of said it's technical progress, but it could be of course efficiency changes or scale efficiency changes and whatever components there exist. So that could be of course then further decomposed with that sort of methods. I don't remember seeing that this kind of structural change components would be combined with this kind of Malmquist index type. So that's something that is open for grabs if someone's interested. Yeah, I think that's all I had. Here are some references if you are interested, and well, if you have questions, comments now would be